Stay hungry, stay foolish.
Before we start into today's episode, I want to thank our sponsor Zai, boldly transforming the future of financial services with a suite of embedded products and services enabling businesses to manage multiple payment workflows and move funds with ease. Check out Zai at hellozai.com. Since our guest has written today's book, recent research strengthens the idea that gay people differ from straight people in more than the direction of their sexual feelings. There is great diversity among lesbians and gay men, to be sure, but in general, homosexuality is part of a collection of gender-atypical traits, just as heterosexuality is part of a collection of gender-typical traits. These different packages arise because the sexual differentiation of the brain goes forward differently in individuals destined to become gay adults as compared with their same-sex heterosexual peers. Differences in genes, sex hormones, and their interactions with the developing brain are what causes this divergence. Our show today will investigate the prenatal brain. It will also investigate the environment and what role that plays, both the environment in the womb and the physical environment outside the womb. What about puberty? What effect does that have? And fascinating studies across animals show that heterosexuality and homosexuality can be manipulated by altering genes. We'll also explore the role that birth order plays in homosexuality and heterosexuality. We have a fascinating episode in store, and today's episode features the author of Gay, Straight, and the Reason Why, The Science of Sexual Orientation, Simon LeVay. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Aidan. Here's the book you're talking about, just to the little bit of promotion at the start.
Absolutely, and I'll have it projected on the screen as well, Simon. It's a magnificent read. I had it on my Kindle, and I absolutely loved it. You've updated it. There's a second revision of that book out for sale as well. Just want to remind people the second edition is with updated studies because this science updates at an immense pace, Simon. Maybe you'll start there because constantly you're seeing updates, new research sparked by some of your research.
Maybe I should start by saying, this is all a hypothesis, if you like, a theory, an idea about how sexual orientation develops. And there's a lot that we don't know. So to say that we've proved anything at this point is, probably overstating the case. We have a lot of evidence for a model, this so-called neurodevelopmental model of sexual orientation. The idea, as you say, that prenatal sex hormones guide the development of the brain in such a way that it can predispose the owner of that brain to not only become gay or straight or perhaps something else, bisexual, but also to develop a package of gender traits that can be more typical of that gender, if you're talking about straight people, or more atypical if you're talking about gay people. But first of all, nothing has been nailed down, to the degree that we'd really, scientists would really like to say it's been proven one way or the other. And the other thing is that up to now, recently, scientists have sort of treated gay people and straight people as sort of monolithic packages, that you're a gay person, so you must be like this, or you're straight, you must be like that. Of course, that's not true, that you have this tremendous diversity among gay people and also among straight people. And that is probably the area where most research now needs to be done. Try and understand why do you have this diversity? Why are some gay people, you just look at them walking down the street, or as soon as they open their mouth, they're gay, right? And some people are gay who you would never guess that particularly. And same with straight people. You get some straight people who you guess would be gay, and they're actually not. So that area is an area where a lot of research needs to be done. And that's, I suppose, the sort of the cutting edge of this whole field of research.
When you think about neurodiversity, it's people with different experiences. And obviously, gay people have experience the world differently because, as we'll talk about later on, there's also differences in the structure of the brain, neurochemical differences, etc. So let's start where the origin started for you back in 91?
My previous research actually had been in the visual system. So I wasn't, a sex researcher as such really at that time, but I was interested in neural development and how the brain and the mind, come to develop. And I saw a study that had been done at UCLA a year previously, which looked at a part of the brain called the hypothalamus, which is now sort of quite famous, I guess you could say. That's at the base of the brain, and it's sort of ancient part of the brain that deals with a lot of life-preserving functions like keeping our body temperature right, eating and drinking, and also our sex lives. And so I... in this study from UCLA, the researchers reported on a small region that was typically different in men and women, larger actually in men on average than in women, about twice as large. And this basically replicated earlier work that had been done in lab animals like rats. In fact, pretty much every mammal that's been looked at now, including humans, there is this structure in the hypothalamus that's typically larger in males than females. And it's known from animal research to be involved in sexual behavior by males directed towards females. So when I saw that, I thought, well, it'd be interesting to look to see whether there'll be differences also related to sexual orientation as well as simply people's sex. And so that's what I set out to do. So this was an autopsy study. I was looking at brains of people who had died, men and women, and also among the men, some of them were gay and some of them had been straight. So the opportunity to do this research was really sparked by the AIDS epidemic because sadly, a lot of people with HIV had died and come to autopsy. Actually, among the people who died was my then partner, who died in late 1989. And so I was, as a gay man myself, I was very aware, of course, of what was going on and sort of moved by the whole thing. And so quite aside from the sort of scientific interest of doing that study, I was also had a sort of personal motivation, if you like. I was wanting to do some research more somehow connected to my identity as a gay man. And I think was very common actually at that time. A lot of gay people, their reaction to the AIDS epidemic was to turn their life around a little bit to be more oriented towards their own sexuality. And so I thought I would do a study myself, looking at brains from men and women who had died, and their brains were available. And what I found basically was that there was a difference in this part of the brain. First of all, I confirmed what the UCLA researchers had found, which was there's a basic sex difference in this part of the brain. But that if you looked at men, the gay men in the study had a structure here. It's called INAH3, or that's just the technical name for it. It was about half the size in the gay men as compared with the straight men. In fact, it was about the same in the gay men as it was in the women in my study. So that's what I reported in that science paper in 1991. And that got a lot of media attention at that time. And it helped spark a sort of series of studies by other people in the same area, looking at what might be going on here, what might be understandable about people's sexual orientation from a biological perspective. And this was a bit contrary to more traditional ideas about sexual orientation, say Freudian ideas, where your sexuality was the result of psychosocial processes like your relationship with your parents, your siblings, or sexual experiences you might have, whether you were sexually molested or that kind of thing. It was taking a more biological approach, looking at genes, hormones, prenatal development, and so on. And a lot of the research that's been done since then, I would say, bolsters the idea that what's going on in your brain before birth has a very profound effect on your sexuality in adulthood.
That one I found absolutely fascinating about, for example, you talk about mice and how the structure of mice in the fetus, for example, they're all beside each other and they can be washed over by neurochemicals if there's a female between two males, for example. I'd love you to share that in a moment. But there's one thing I wanted to say, because it was one of the reasons I reached out to you, was so many people after you wrote that paper in 1991 reached out with thanks to you because they had this inner sense of being born gay. And it wasn't a bad lifestyle choice as it was often made out to be at the time. And that's very important. And one of the reasons I wanted to share your work. Also, the importance of neurodiversity and understanding that neurodiversity, because if the brain is a lens through which we experience the world and your brain is structured differently, you're going to see the world differently, and that can be harnessed for good. And then the other thing was that it had a fair amount of critics, like you say. For example, when you study the brains of people who sadly passed away because of AIDS, people said, well, that's because of the AIDS. The brain changed shape afterwards, which, is grasping at straws, you might say, as well.
Let me take the last point that you mentioned. Yeah, it was definitely a concern to me. Everyone who died and their brain had been autopsied had died of something. And in my study, all the gay men had died of complications of AIDS, as had about half of the straight men in the study too. I made sure there were plenty of straight men who had died of AIDS in the study also. And in fact, if I just compared the gay men who died of AIDS and the straight men who died of AIDS, I got the same result. In other words, the structure in the hypothalamus was half the size in the gay men who died of AIDS and the straight men who died of AIDS. So there was this difference even just looking at the people who died of AIDS. So I don't think that the disease itself was the cause of why the structure was small in the gay men. Actually, just perhaps to jump ahead a little bit, a few years after that, there was a study on sheep done by a group in Oregon Health Sciences University, where they found very much the same thing. It turns out, I didn't know this, but apparently some fraction of male sheep, of rams, preferentially mate with other males. And it's about 4%, I think, of male sheep will mate, even when they have a choice of mating with rams or with ewes, the female sheep, they go for the rams. And what this group in Oregon found out was basically exactly the same as what I found in humans, that this structure in the homosexual rams was about half the size compared with the heterosexual rams, even though these rams had not died of anything except they were sacrificed, to have their brains studied. So that reassured me, if you like, that I wasn't just looking at a pathological effect. Just sort of in the same general area, it's true that a lot of gay men liked my research because they thought of it as bolstering the idea that they were born gay. I certainly have this feeling about myself that I was born gay, but I don't actually remember being born. And even if I did, I don't think I'd remember what my sexual orientation was at the time. So that's just a sort of way of saying, I suppose, that you feel it's a very deep part of yourself, that it's opposed to the idea that you somehow, chose to be gay, which is a sort of idea that's been thrown at the gay community sometimes by, Christian conservatives or something like that. And it's a bit of a crazy idea because, if you chose to be gay, that would be a sort of life-altering decision that you would remember. Even if you were blind drunk at the time that you made the decision, made the choice, you'd remember it. Most gay people don't remember having made any choice like that. And anyway, so there are some gay people who are very uneasy with this kind of research for a variety of reasons. They may be academics who feel that being gay is not something that comes out of yourself, but it's something sort of imposed on you by society. It's a sort of label that society puts on people, and then you have to sort of live up to that label, if you like. I think there is an element of that. I mean, clearly, how we think about our sexuality is strongly influenced by what society tries to inscribe in us, if you like. But I don't think that has to do with the actual attractions we feel. I think that has to do with how we deal with it, how we present ourselves, what kind of relationships we get into, whether we actually engage in gay sex or whether we decide it's wrong and we try to live as a heterosexual lifestyle. All that sort of thing is very much sensitive to social forces. But our actual direction of sexual attractions, I don't think that is. I mean, I've seen no evidence really for that.
Let's jump on to some of the differences then as well, because we're limited on time and there's so much in the book. There, you cover every piece of research that's out there at the time of writing, and the second edition as well is in the book. So it's difficult to try and hone in. And if I pick one, Simon, you kind of go, there's a better one than that. Please do just brush me out of the way. You say that Roger Gorski and his colleagues at UCLA made a key discovery back in the 1970s. This was really great research for you to build upon.
Right. They were working at that time on rats and in the 1970s. Roger Gorski and his colleagues, I think one of his postdocs actually, spotted this sex difference in the brains of rats in the hypothalamus. This basic, what they call a sex dimorphism, which just means a structural difference between males and females in the hypothalamus. And the structure was larger in the male rats than in the female rats. And what Gorski then went on to do was to look at the development of that structure and show that it was controlled by levels of sex hormones circulating in the fetal rat right before and around the time of birth. And that he could alter that. For example, he could add to the hormone levels, testosterone levels in female fetuses, or take away testosterone levels in male fetuses. And that would ultimately change the size of the structure in the brain and also change the animal's sexual behavior when it was adult. Whereas if you took an adult rat and did the same sort of intervention, altering hormone levels, he didn't produce changes like that. There was some kind of sensitive period when the brain's first assembling itself, where the levels of these sex hormones are so crucial. They enter the brain and they control the development and survival of neurons in the hypothalamus.
This was the piece I found fascinating, and forgive me, my mind works by metaphor, and I was thinking about how, for example, you had the structure, you had a diagram in the book about the structure of rats and how they have babies. They have multiple babies at once, and it's almost like a daisy chain of a necklace, and each daisy is a little embryo. And if there was a male, female, male, you have this washing over effect of testosterone, for example, and actually the female embryo can pick up some of those. And the reason I mention that is the importance of that for prenatal influence on how that baby forms later on. And also then the other thing, just to add, and this is interest of time, is that you talk about 3 puberties that happen. One is before birth, around the 12-week mark, I think, by memory. Then there's again, just after birth, a kind of mini puberty, and then there's puberty itself. Those aspects are important, again, for sexual development.
Yes, that's quite true. Most attention has been focused on this prenatal puberty, if you want to call it that. I don't think people use that phrase with regard to the prenatal period, but that seems to be the most critical period. Something is then going on immediately after birth in humans, where you have another surge of testosterone in males. We don't really know what that's good for exactly. And then at puberty, there's another surge. Obviously, testosterone levels go up hugely, particularly in males. And that also probably influences brain development, but we don't really know very much about what's going on there. But just getting back to this story you mentioned about the rats in the fetal rats. Yes, they're lined up in a sort of row in the mother's womb, and the male rats are busy the male fetuses are busy producing testosterone, and some of it leaks out and can affect neighboring females. And those females, you can see the effects on this structure in the hypothalamus that will be larger than if they had not had a male right next to them, if you like. And this process also affects the behavior of the females when they're adult. You have a similar effect actually in cattle. You have sometimes, a cow will have two calves in the womb, and a male and a female. And the female apparently picks up some testosterone from the male, and that female fetus, when she's a grown-up cow, shows atypical behavior. Will be more likely to mount other females, for example, than females fetuses who were just singletons in the womb, if you like. So we don't really know whether there's any effect like that in humans. If you have a boy and a girl, twins in the womb, whether the girl is affected at all by the presence of the boy in the womb, that there's been sort of mixed evidence on that. And I don't think there's any strong evidence about at this point about an influence of one on the other.
There's much to learn here. Like you mentioned, for example, you saw the hypothalamus differences in rats, for example, from the 70s, and then again in those people you studied, those brains that you studied. But also you talk about how, well, we can affect this also in as simple an organism as a fruit fly. You've seen this huge effect when you start to almost tamper with the genes to actually change sexual behavior of fruit flies.
Yes, you can. There's several genes that have been identified in fruit flies that are known to be involved in the regulation of sexual behavior and the direction of sexual attraction, if you like, or the responses of males to females or females to males. And that it's pretty easy to tamper with the genetic makeup of fruit flies, and one can easily show that their sexual behaviors can be modified or reversed quite easily, actually, by changing their genetic makeup.
I'm really interested in, for example, the neurodiversity effect and understanding, because I think when we understand things, we're more empathetic. I want to build on this because you say, to some extent, homosexuality is part of a package that I mentioned in the introduction of mental traits, many of which can be considered gender variant or gender non-conformist. And non-conformity is a great word when it comes to innovation, because you want people who go against the grain. And you say, whereas heterosexuality is part of a package of gender-typical or gender-conformist traits. Let's share this idea with regards to children, because we start to see these traits in early childhood.
Absolutely. Kids who later become gay tend to be different from other children. And there's, you're getting into the area of stereotypes now, because that's the trouble with this whole area of research. It's not that you can predict with certainty what the future sexual orientation of any child is going to be. But in a statistical sense, there's a very strong connection between a child's gendered behavior when it's 5, 6, 7 years old, and that child's ultimate sexual orientation when it's adult. And that's been shown in many ways, actually, by longitudinal studies where you look at kids when they're young and then follow them. It's also been done, for example, a study that was done at Northwestern University a few years ago, where the researchers recruited people who happened to have videotapes of themselves when they're young children. And the researchers took these videotapes. The kids were not doing anything particular. They were just sort of being themselves, playing around. And they took short clips, maybe about 10-second clips from each videotape, showed it to people who didn't know what the actual sexual orientation of these kids was when they were adult. and asked them to put these kids on a spectrum of gender conformity to gender nonconformity. And the result was very, very striking, that the kids who ultimately became gay or lesbian adults were on average much shifted towards the gender nonconformist end of that spectrum, if you like, compared with the kids who became straight adults. And people often think, if a child says, a child born a boy, born male, who very much acts like a girl or says that he wants to be a girl or actually insists he is a girl, that child is destined to become transgender adult. Actually, that's not really true. Most of these kids, these very gender nonconformist kids, become sort of lose this desire to change their sex. Many of them, actually most of them, become gay or lesbian adults, but they don't want to change their sex anymore. They abandon that desire usually around the time of puberty. And so there is a connection, if you like, between kids' childhood gender traits and their adult sexual orientation. It makes you want to be cautious about helping a child transition, if you like, if you know that the child is most likely to abandon that desire at about 13 or 14 years of age.
More work that you talked about in here was fascinating. And again, I'm going to this idea of seeing the world differently. And this is where you talk about actually the behavioral traits of other mammals. For example, rhesus monkeys, the people thing aspect, where chimps will actually see the face and the expressions of others more. Male chimps will actually play with toys very much like a child would. They engage in rough and tumble play. Those aspects are fascinating because they play a huge role in your research as well.
First of all, I should say, I'm not an active researcher anymore. I just write about other people's research at this point. So I wanted to make clear that my own research goes back to that study I talked about before. But yes, when people thinking about childhood play behavior and the toys that kids use, there's a lot of people say, oh, that's, you give children certain toys, and that's why, a girl is playing with dolls or a boy is not playing with dolls, because if he grabs a doll, his parents say, no, that's a girl's whatever. There may be some of that. I'm sure there is some of that. But nevertheless, there's some sort of fundamental difference between boys and girls, typically, that they prefer different toys. And that's been well observed in monkeys too. That you can give, you give juvenile monkeys, say dolls or cars or those kinds of human toys that are more typically preferred by boys or girls. And the monkeys very strongly prefer, just like humans, the young male monkeys prefer the toys that require movement, activity, and the girls tend to prefer the dolls and things like that. Not the girls, the female juvenile monkeys prefer the toys that girls would prefer. So there's something, these are toys that the monkeys have never seen before. So there's something that goes beyond simply, what parents give to their kids. There's something innate about these toy preferences. And when you see a kid who's strongly preferring toys for the other sex, that seems to be part of a package of gender atypical traits that may eventually lead to the child becoming a gay adult, but not necessarily. It's not 100% thing.
Again, in interest of time, Simon, I'm going to jump ahead because there's so much in each of these chapters. You talk about childhood development and then, for example, persistence through adulthood and those type of things. And I'm going to skim over that for the moment because I wanted to turn our attention onto research on cognitive differences between gay and straight people. You explore here, for example, visuospatial skills, intelligence, occupational preferences, and much more. Perhaps at a high level, you'll tell us a bit about this.
Yes, there's been a lot of studies in this area. And if you look at occupational preferences, for example, that there are very strong sex differences to start off with. With women typically preferring more people-oriented occupations, and men typically preferring more thing-oriented occupations. And that difference has been, and again, I want to emphasize, it's an average thing. It's not like, every man wants to be a mechanic and every woman wants to be a nurse or something like that. Far from it. But if you look at large numbers, there's a very clear statistical difference between the sexes. That is true whatever country or culture has been looked at. The more gender equitable a culture is, the more that men and women have the choices to do their own thing, the stronger these differences become. So that's a basic sex difference. And when you look at gays and lesbians, you find that on average, this is gender shifted, so that gay men tend to be more towards people-oriented jobs, lesbians perhaps more towards thing-oriented jobs. Again, I'm making these generalizations, and I feel bad about that because there's just millions of people who don't fit those stereotypes, if you like. But we scientists like to look at statistical averages to try to see the underlying truth, if you like, and that's what's been reported. And maybe I should add to that, gay people are not monolithic. They're not all of a kind. There are really differences among gay people, among gay guys and among lesbians and among bisexual people that need to be explored. And that's an area that is really the boundary that we're trying to push back right now.
A couple of other things are probably important to mention. You go into, for example, the environment. So not only the prenatal environment, so the womb, for example, but actually then the home environment afterwards. And I'm always stuck. We had Bruce Lipton on the show talking about epigenetics in the past, and he gave me a great term that genes load the gun and the environment pulls the trigger. Maybe this will bring together the idea of the environment and then actually the role genes play and then the role epigenetics plays.
Well, yes, that's an area, again, that needs to be explored. Epigenetic changes are changes to the genome that are not the actual letters of the genetic code. They're chemical changes that affect how the gene actually works, how it's expressed, as you say. And there have been some studies suggesting that this could play a role in sexual orientation too, that there are some modifications to the genes that, at least in some gay people, that might influence how the genes are expressed. And so two people with the same genes might actually develop differently because of these different modifications when they're children or puberty or something like that. So it wouldn't be entirely the genes that you got when you were a fertilized egg, if you like. It's also how the genes are actually expressed thanks to these epigenetic changes that we don't really greatly understand, but they are a route by which the environment can feed back in and influence how these genes that we are born with work and how they actually sort of drive our behavior in some direction or another.
We've mentioned chemicals, we've mentioned structure, your area of expertise was the brain as well. So you looked at, for example, anatomical differences in the brain. We mentioned the hypothalamus, but there's also stuff like lateralization in the brain, amygdalae or difference in amygdalae, and this goes female male as well. And it's probably worth talking about that. And then maybe we'll have time to finish up talking about hereditary traits as well, because that's another important aspect to look at.
Right. It turns out that the difference I found in the hypothalamus is just one of a whole suite of differences that have been reported in the brain that may also be influenced by hormones prenatally or perhaps postnatally too. So there are, when you're talking about sexuality, you're not talking about just one little part of the brain that controls your sex life. There's a whole sort of network of structures. You mentioned the amygdala, the hippocampus, various cortical regions are also involved. And these all probably are somewhat different in the way they're organized in gay people and straight people. There have been reports of anatomical differences in the cerebral cortex and other structures. And that's certainly been reported in laboratory animals too. There's hormonal effects on the amygdala, as you say, a structure that's rather centrally involved in when you see, for example, a face, do you find it sexually attractive? And what you do about that. The amygdala is a sort of structure deep in the brain that it seems to play a key role in that kind of analysis that the brain plays. But that's mostly research for the future. We don't really know in great detail about other structures in the brain, how they operate differently in gay and straight people. So I don't think we should try and get into that too much. You mentioned the hereditary aspect of it. Yeah, being gay runs in families, no question about that. And if you're gay, you're quite likely to have gay relatives. I had, he's no longer living, but I had a gay brother, for example, my older brother, who's also gay. And there are other gay people in my family too, in the next generation. So, and that it probably reflects the fact that there are genes that pass down in certain families that do influence people's sexual orientation. And there have been recently studies looking for these genes. So we know these genes exist, but the question is, what are they? Where are they in the genome, and so on? And that's work that's currently going on, thanks to projects like the UK Biobank project, which has followed tens of thousands of individuals. Many of them have had their brain scanned, they've had their genes analyzed, and so on. And it's become more and more clear that there are certain regions on certain chromosomes that do influence people's sexuality, both in men and in women. But there isn't a single gay gene. It's not like, you have this gene, you're gay, you don't have the gene, you're straight. It's rather that there's a whole bunch of genes which together form a genetic network, just as the different parts of the brain form a brain network. And how these networks, these genetic networks and neural networks operate is hugely difficult challenge. We don't really know yet. And that's what people are trying to unravel, if you like. We know that the biology is important. We know certain aspects of it in some detail, but to get the whole picture, it's going to be decades of work, I think, to really understand that.
That's what I love about what you've done here is you've been at least part of the snowball that's starting an avalanche, and as the means to research become easier with technology, and the price of gene mapping drops, etc., it all becomes more feasible. A couple of more ones for you that just hopefully squeeze in. You mentioned you have an older brother. There's a chapter called The Older Brother Effect, and that's important as well, because a fascinating piece of research you mentioned comes out of Canada, which is a question: does the order in which you're born have an impact on you and your sexual orientation?
This is part of a much bigger field of research on birth order and psychology. There's many ways apparently in which your position in the sequence of births influences your personality, your interests, and so on. And the general idea is that older brothers, the firstborn brothers particularly, or firstborn children, either sex, have expectations imposed on them by their parents and others, whereas the younger kids are more free to do their own thing, if you like. And they tend to be more nonconformist, more rebellious, they're more exploratory, and perhaps more creative, and maybe politically different. With regard to sexual orientation, the story is that if you're a man and you have at least one older brother, that increases your chances of being gay. And in fact, the more older brothers you have, the more likelihood it is that you're going to be gay. And that's, as you say, this Canadian psychologists have done most of the research on that, Ray Blanchard and his colleagues in Toronto. This effect is not, it's not at all, again, it's a sort of average thing. I mean, yeah, I have an older brother and I'm gay. So you could say, okay, I'm gay because I have an older brother, but my older brother was also gay, and he didn't have an older brother. So you can't just say, oh, you have 5 older brothers and therefore you must be gay. Actually, my youngest brother, who has 4 older brothers, is straight as anyone. So it doesn't always work out like that way. But on average, which is what we scientists like, looking at statistically, there is an effect like that. And the scientists who do this research, they say it's a biological factor that's something to do with when the mother has a male fetus, when she's carrying a baby that's a boy, she may develop some sort of immune reaction to that male fetus, which then affects the development of subsequent fetuses in such a way as to increase the chances they'll be gay. And they seem to have the statistics to bear out that finding. So it's another factor, if you like, that influences people's sexuality. It doesn't seem to operate in women, as far as we know. So this is only to do with guys.
The second last chapter goes into beyond the black and white of gay or straight. It goes into that diversity we talked about of thinking, of sexuality, of a spectrum, for example. Perhaps we'll say a word on that. And again, this is like the very high level of the research that you go into each of these chapters. I want to make that very, very clear.
Traditionally, it's always been thought that there are different kinds of gay people and different kinds of lesbians. For example, there's the butch and femme lesbians. That's an idea that's been going around for generations. And it used to be, if you go back to the 1950s, there was this sort of social construction. So if you had a lesbian relationship, it had to be a butch lesbian and a femme lesbian, a more masculine lesbian and a more feminine lesbian. And that's changed a lot over the years. You still see butch femme relationships, but you also see relationships that don't fit in with that at all. Similarly with guys, you do sometimes see you have this top-bottom distinction, which is really to do with sexual behavior. And that's true. It's not a dominant thing. Lots of gay men are sort of versatile, not committed to one behavior or the other. But in any case, these things have been looked at recently by a bunch of psychologists. And the reports are that you see biological differences such that butch lesbians tend to have anatomical differences as compared with femme lesbians. So particularly in these finger length ratios that we talked about before, those differences you see in butch lesbians, but not in femme lesbians, who are more comparable to heterosexual women. So people have got hold of the idea maybe that the butch lesbians are the more born that way lesbians, and the femme lesbians are more somehow bisexual, or perhaps more lesbian for reasons that don't have to do with biology, and that there might be something similar with tops and bottoms among gay men. This is an area that's being actively researched right now, and I don't think we can say exactly what's going on, but that's the area I think that needs to be studied more than anything.
Simon, I could talk to you for all day, but you have an appointment and you have to go for that appointment. And absolutely loved your work. I know you have a new book coming out as well, and I'll ask you to share where people can find you and find your new book. Maybe you'll tell us a little bit about that book. Before we do, I have a closing quote that I love from the end of your book that really... Because I engaged with the book before I got here, and then I saw this at the end. I was like, that's exactly why I wanted to share this work. You say, the kaleidoscopic blend of gender variant and gender typical traits that characterizes gay people is exactly what enables us to make our own unique contributions to society. It's the reason we should be valued, celebrated, and welcomed into society rather than merely being tolerated. I absolutely love that, because that's exactly what I wanted to achieve by having you on the show, and I'm sure that's what you want to achieve by doing this work. But over to you, where can people find you, and what's your final message for our audience, Simon?
Research into sexual orientation started with trying to figure out what's wrong with gay people, right? I mean, that was the whole thought behind this research 30, 40, 50 years ago. And I think we found the answer to that question. There's nothing wrong with gay people, right? But beyond that, now we realize that our sexuality, our sexual orientation is an important part of who we are. It's not just who we want to sleep with, I mean, that's obviously, a huge part of it, but it makes us different people who are able to make somewhat different contributions to society. And I think that, I think parents should feel blessed to have a gay kid. And I think more and more parents are actually, because they know that this kid will be a little different. We'll have a path to tread that's perhaps a little more creative, or somehow a little more diverse, if you like, than everyone being the same. And so I hope that the biology will help people understand and accept that. And if that's the messages people get from this kind of research, great. Now, with regard to people want to find out more, there is the book that you've been talking about, Gay, Straight, and the Reason Why, that's out already. I have another book that's coming out early next year, Attraction, Love, Sex, The Inside Story. The reason I'm hesitating with the title is that my publicist just changed the title at the last moment, and they didn't like the title I had with it. So that's the title. It's coming out from Columbia University Press. And that's a much broader look at sex, not just sexual orientation, which is just one chapter. It's about everything we know about sex, from a psychological and, from a scientific perspective, if you like. But anyway, I have a website. It's called simonlevay.com. Pretty creative name. www.simonlevay.com. I think that's what it is. And if you just Google my name, Simon LeVay, you'll find it. It'll be right there at the top, I think, after my Wikipedia entry. So it's easy to find me and the books that I've written, some of which are nothing to do with sex. So I want to say, Aidan, thanks so much for having me on the show. I really appreciate your commitment to diversity, including neurodiversity. And I wish you the best with your future guests.
Thank you, Simon. And I want to mention the other books, because I was torn which one to cover. You have The Sexual Brain there. You had what was the word? Queer Science was in there as well. When Science Goes Wrong. There's so much work in there that I was like kind of going, oh, which one will I get? Because it was difficult to book you onto the show as well. So, and it's simonlevay.com is the website. All your publications are listed there as well. And I highly recommend it. Recommend all your work. And most of all, I want to celebrate you for your work on neurodiversity and doing a piece for the world to help people understand things. It's been a pleasure talking to you, author of Gay, Straight, and the Reason Why, The Science of Sexual Orientation, Simon LeVay. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Aidan. I'm always impressed at people like you who have no, as far as I know, no particular background in the area, are able to deal with this.
As always, thank you to our sponsor, Zai, boldly transforming the future of financial services with a suite of embedded products and services, enabling businesses to manage multiple payment workflows and move funds with ease. You can find Zai at hellozai.com.